history of Oxford University. This is the presidential transition that went very wrong. The president of Magdalen College, Oxford, my old college, Henry Clark, died on March the 24th, 1687. Early the following month, King James II nominated one Anthony Farmer to be the college's next president. Farmer was in multiple ways an unsuitable, indeed ineligible candidate, as Macaulay tells us in his History of England, Volume 2, Chapter 8. This man's life had been a series of shameful acts. He had been a member of the University of Cambridge. That's just a lovely bit of comic timing from Macaulay. And had escaped expulsion only by a timely retreat. He had then joined the dissenters. Then he had gone to Oxford, had entered himself at Magdalen, and had soon become notorious there for every kind of vice. He generally reeled into his college at night, speechless with liquor. I hadn't realised that I had a role model so far back. He was celebrated for having headed a disgraceful riot at Abingdon. He had been a constant frequenter of noted haunts of libertines. At length he had turned pandar, which you all know means pimp, had exceeded even the ordinary vileness of his vile calling, and had received money from dissolute young gentlemen, commoners, for services such as it is not good that history should record. This wretch, however, had pretended to turn papist. His apostasy atoned for all his vices, and though still a youth, he was selected to rule a grave and religious society in which the scandal given by his depravity was still fresh. As a Roman Catholic, he was disqualified for academical office by the general law of the land. Never having been a fellow of Magdalen College or of New College, he was disqualified for the vacant presidency by a special ordinance of William of Waynflete, 15th century founder of the college. William of Waynflete had also enjoined those who partook of his bounty to have a particular regard to moral character in choosing their head. And even if he had left no such injunction, a body chiefly composed of divines could not with decency entrust such a man as Farmer with the government of a place of education. So the fellows petitioned against Farmer, and on the last statutory day, elected John Hoe, who was a London-born fellow of the college, and the visitor of the college at once admitted Hoe. But the fellows were then cited before the Court of Ecclesiastical Commission. Hoe's election was annulled on June the 22nd. The vice president of Magdalen was suspended, and on August the 14th, the fellows were instructed to admit Samuel Parker, the Bishop of Oxford, who, although an Anglican and obviously a somewhat less disreputable figure than Farmer, was also unqualified according to the college statutes. A few weeks later, the king himself, James II, and you all understand that he was a Roman Catholic, hence the crisis, came to Oxford and harangued the fellows of Magdalen. Here's Macaulay again. When they appeared before him, he treated them with an insolence such as never had been shown to their predecessors by the Puritan visitors. "You have not dealt with me like gentlemen," he exclaimed. "You have been unmannerly, as well as undutiful." Sorry, I just slipped into another character there. You'll see where I'm going by now. They fell on their knees and tendered a petition. He would not look at it. "Is this your Church of England loyalty?" I could not have believed that so many clergymen of the Church of England would have been concerned in such a business. "Go home! Get you gone! I am king! I will be obeyed! Go to your chapel this instant and admit the Bishop of Oxford. Let those who refuse look to it. They shall feel the whole weight of my hand. They shall know what it is to incur the displeasure of their sovereign." Fellows, still kneeling before him, again offered their petition. He angrily flung it down. "Get you gone, I tell you. I will receive nothing from you till you have admitted the bishop." Macaulay goes on. The fellows retired and instantly assembled in their chapel. The question was propounded whether they would comply with His Majesty's command. The other fellows who were at the meeting declared that in all things lawful they were ready to obey the king, but that they would not violate their statutes and their oaths. "Will you submit," said the Bishop of Chester, "to our visitation?" "I submit to it," said John Hoe with great dexterity, "so far as it is consistent with the laws, and no further." "My lords," said he, "you have this day deprived me of my freehold. I hereby protest against all your proceedings as illegal, unjust, and null, and I appeal from you to our sovereign lord the king in his courts of justice." So I'm just now going to take you to the moment of the expulsion of the fellows and demise. A demi was a particular category of scholar. It still exists, which is half a fellow. I was once a demi. And this is a painting done much later in 1884 of the expulsion of the fellows. Here's what happened. This is a classic moment when the power of the executive collides with the independence of an academic institution. On October the 20th, 3 royal commissioners with 3 troops of horse arrived to visit the college. After declaring Hoe no longer president, they struck his name out of the Buttery Book. I'll show you the Buttery Book in a minute. When the Court of Ecclesiastical Commission met again on the 25th, it installed Parker by proxy and broke into the president's lodgings. On November the 15th, this is the scene here, 25 fellows were expelled, and they were also declared incapable of receiving any other preferment, any other employment. A handful submitted and remained. And then, plot twist, Parker, the guy they forced upon the college, died. Well, it was the 17th century. People were always dying. And then it gets worse. The king insisted on installing as president Bonaventure Gifford. Bonaventure is a name we don't hear nearly often enough. Anybody thinking of a name for a child? Bonaventure. He was a Catholic priest, and James had already made him Vicar Apostolic of the Midland District of England. This led to a further rebellion by the fellows. 7 more revolted and were deprived of their fellowships. Only 2 of the original fellowship remained. Here's Macaulay again. "The college was turned into a popish seminary. The Roman Catholic service was performed in the chapel. In one day, 12 Roman Catholics were admitted fellows." Well, I wonder if this story reminds you of anything. To refresh your memories, on April 3rd, just a month ago, Harvard University received a letter from the federal government signed by representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education, which is, I believe, represented here, and the General Services Administration. The letter stated that Harvard had, quote, "fundamentally failed to protect American students and faculty from anti-Semitic violence and harassment, in addition to other alleged violations of Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In particular, the university had permitted a hostile environment for Jewish students in violation of Title VI. Before I go on, I just want to make it clear to you how important in the history of Oxford the expulsion of the fellows of Magdalen was and remains. They actually reenacted the events of 1687 in 1907. Here's a photograph I found of the reenactment in the college in Magdalen, just by the bridge. When I was a kid, I used to read a very nerdy magazine called Look and Learn. Now, if you want to see where your child is going, if the child collects a magazine like Look and Learn and arranges the back numbers chronologically, but also creates an index for use, you'll know that that child will become a professor. That was me. This is the Buttery Book, which is one of the surviving documents that records on a weekly basis which fellows and scholars are in residence by the fact that they're being fed. And on this page, I know it's not very clear, but it's the best I can do. You can see that the fellows and demise names had been scratched out. These were the fellows imposed, the Catholic fellows imposed on the college, and subsequently, I'll come to what happened later, subsequently when they were expelled, you can see that the Buttery book was amended. So these are the protagonists. Here's James II looking down his regal nose, as you do when you're king. And there's John Ho on the other side, the president who refused to submit. And here are their contemporary counterparts. As you know, Harvard received another letter from the federal government just over a week after the first one, which required that the university take a whole list of actions as a condition of receiving continued federal funding. And I'll just give you a few highlights in case you haven't read the letter. Greg Lukianoff did a good summary. I'm sad Greg's not here because what I'm going to say will make him tremendously cross. But here's Greg's summary. Harvard has to hire a third party to audit certain programs, identify faculty members who contributed to anti-Semitism on campus, and sanction them, quote, within the bounds of academic freedom and the First Amendment. It has to carry out meaningful discipline for conduct violations since 2023. It has to implement merit-based hiring and admissions reforms to be audited by a third party. It has to report immediately any conduct violation by an international student to the federal government. It has to shutter all DEI programs and offices. It has to ban masks. I like that little twist. It has to reform governance, quote, to reduce the power held by faculty, whether tenured or untenured, and administrators more committed to activism than scholarship. And it has to ensure through a series of audits, hires, and transfers that, quote, each department, field, or teaching unit is individually viewpoint diverse. Not long after issuing these demands, the government suspended $2.2 billion in federal grants and $60 million in contracts, claiming that Harvard had rejected its demands on anti-Semitism and racial discrimination. And that wasn't all. Yesterday, as you perhaps noticed, President Trump published one of his regular truths. And I do enjoy calling them truths. We are going to be taking away Harvard's tax-exempt status, he wrote on his social media platform. It's what they deserve. I don't need to tell an audience as well informed as this that Harvard has a 501c3 tax-exempt status as an educational institution, which means it doesn't pay income taxes on its net earnings and its donors get income tax deductions. You know all that. But the point is that that status could be revoked if, say, an audit found that it had violated the relevant rules. Now, one possibility, and it's a serious one, is that Harvard's admissions policies or its tolerance of anti-Semitism violate public policy. And that's the standard that the Supreme Court set in 1982 when it upheld an IRS decision to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University in Green Hill, South Carolina, over the school's racially discriminatory policies, which included, at that time, rules against interracial dating and marriage, rules that I personally have violated. That would have been the end of my time at BJU. You may not know, I discovered today that BJU regained its tax-exempt status in 2017, having abandoned the interracial dating rule in 2000. The key point there is the time that elapsed between the Supreme Court ruling and the restoration of tax-exempt status. Now, we all know that Harvard is tremendously rich. Endowment is massive, beyond the dreams of Croesus, $50 billion or something. But as my dear friend Jim Hankins pointed out in the Wall Street Journal just the other day, most of the endowment's tied up in donor-restricted funds. In any case, it only covers about 37% of the university's annual operating costs. And for the rest, the university has to rely on tuition, federal grants, that's 11%, plus current gifts, plus borrowing, of which it is having to do rather a lot right now. So, in other words, the Trump administration's actions are not trivial threats to Harvard's financial stability. Now, like the Fellows of Magdalen back in 1687, Harvard has resisted the government's encroachment on its traditional privileges. On April the 21st, the university filed a lawsuit against the administration. The suit argues that the government has, quote, violated its constitutional rights and imperiled its academic independence. Alan Garber, the university's president, who's the John Ho figure in the analogy, that's him on the right, someone I've known for many years, has said that the threat to revoke the school's tax-exempt status is, quote, highly illegal and destructive to Harvard. Quote, tax-exempt status is granted to educational institutions to enable them to successfully carry out their mission of education and for research universities of research. This was Alan Garber talking to the Wall Street Journal last week. Quote, obviously that would be severely impaired if we were to lose our tax-exempt status. The message that it sends to the educational community would be a very dire one, that political disagreements could be used as a basis to pose what might be an existential threat to so many educational institutions. And the issue has, of course, become political, just as the case of the presidency of Magdalen did back in the 1680s. Yesterday, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer asked the Internal Revenue Service Inspector General to investigate whether Trump has violated the law and if the IRS has begun auditing nonprofits based on White House requests. Now, as Macaulay tells us, James II made a mistake in taking on the Fellows of Magdalen. Unlikely heroes, though those gentlemen were. Here's what Macaulay tells us. The nature of the academical system of England is such that no event which seriously affects the interests and honour of either university, in those days there really were only Oxford and Cambridge, can fail to excite a strong feeling throughout the country. Every successive blow, therefore, which fell on Magdalen College was felt to the extremities of the kingdom. In the coffee houses of London, in the inns of court, in the closes of all the cathedral towns, in parsonages and manor houses scattered over the remotest shires, pity for the sufferers and indignation against the government went on growing. And those of you who have immersed yourselves in the study of the Glorious Revolution will know that James II's time on the throne of England was rapidly running out. And to this day, histories of the fall of James will tell you that one of his major blunders was this attack, this brazen assertion of royal authority and of his Catholic religion on Magdalen College, one of the wealthiest colleges of Oxford. When you next go to Oxford, make sure you see Magdalen Tower, the most splendid architectural edifice of the university. Think of this moment, a critical historical moment, one of those rare occasions when the fellows of an Oxford college really matter. So the obvious question arises, the one you're waiting for me to get to, do we now have to defend Harvard against the American equivalent of James II in the same way that the wider English public rallied to the side of the Fellows of Magdalen? Greg, our old friend Greg Lukianoff, says that we do, quote, on principle. And here I'm going to quote from his recent essay on the subject. when the federal government is exceeding its power or claiming new powers that it never previously had, we have to step in. We have to defend against it. Its demands of Harvard would catastrophically undermine academic freedom, free speech, and institutional independence on campus. The federal government dictating the hiring, admissions, and academic freedom of college is no solution to either the problem of Harvard in particular or anti-Semitism on campus in general. And he goes on to analyze the ways in which, on principle, we should support Harvard against the administration. Atul Gawande has an essay in the New Yorker pointing out that more than 90% of the $9 billion federal dollars that Harvard receives that are now in danger supports life sciences primarily through the National Institutes of Health, and 3/4 of it goes to 5 independent Boston hospitals, including Brigham and Women's Hospital. And as one of my children was born by an emergency C-section at Brigham and Women's, I would surely be a hypocrite if I just shrugged my shoulders at this point and said, too bad. And yet, I believe we all, and especially those of us who've devoted time, energy, and money to founding a new and politically independent university, must really think twice before we uncritically embrace FIRE's narrative. FIRE is Greg's foundation for individual rights of inquiry. Embrace that narrative that Trump is the villain, like James II, and the professors of Harvard are the heroes, like the fellows of Magdalen. Just last week, the Harvard Presidential Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism and Anti-Israel Bias published its report. It makes for shocking reading. Let me quote from it. A Harvard faculty member who works closely with students reported to us that some Jewish students choose to hide their identities on campus, which was something the faculty member could not have imagined would ever be the case at Harvard. We have heard from many dozens of non-Jewish students, faculty, and staff who were profoundly troubled at what they described as an intolerance that has crept into higher education and that is also on display at Harvard. Many people saw Harvard as a place where over time many students' politics became more radical and where students became less tolerant of people who disagree with them. According to the report, and I quote again, student activists attempt to drive Israeli students and Jewish students who feel connected to Israel out of student life. This often takes the form of, quote, shunning. And American Jewish students told us they felt pressure to condemn Israel to prove they were, quote, one of the good ones, meaning an anti-Zionist Jew, and faced social consequences when they refused. Moreover, Jewish students told us stories of Harvard-run, quote, privilege trainings, where they were told that they were deemed to be privileged not only by dint of being identified as white, but also because of their Jewishness. Now, there's a gem from the report that caught the eye of my fellow trustee, Joe Lonsdale, yesterday. And it is on page 150 of the report of the Presidential Task Force. Quote, a session in 4 sections out of 28 of a required course for all Harvard Graduate School of Education students included the following graphic about white supremacy. The graphic labels opposition to the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement as coded genocide, placing it alongside the Anti-Defamation League. Both are positioned merely one step removed from overt genocide, which includes examples like lynching and the KKK. The instructor displayed the graphic on screen for an extended period of time without addressing its problematic characterization of Jewish organizations and perspectives. I don't think there can therefore be any doubt that Harvard, once not so long ago notable for the high proportion of Jewish faculty and students, has a serious anti-Semitism problem. Here's some FIRE research. nationally, 55% of students said it would be difficult to have an open and honest conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At Harvard, it's 67%. Among faculty nationwide, 70% have a hard time talking openly and honestly about the conflict. At Harvard, it's 84%. And that's not Harvard's only problem. It has an anti-conservatism problem, too. Let me show you a few illustrations of this problem. According to the Harvard Crimson's 2023 survey, only 2.5% of faculty respondents identified as conservatives. 2.5%, with more than 3/4 identifying as liberal. If you look at the class of 2027, which the Crimson surveyed and analyzed in detail just less than 2 years ago, more than half, in fact 65%, nearly 2/3, identified as progressive or very progressive, you can see the chart here, while only 8.4% identified as conservative or very conservative. You can see that from the point of view of partisan allegiance, Harvard is a democratic institution. And what is really striking to me is the extreme hostility of the class of 2027 to President Donald Trump. 87% have an unfavorable view of him. Not surprisingly, while 41% of liberal students report feeling comfortable discussing controversial topics, only 25% of moderates and 17% of conservative Harvard students feel similarly. And let's not forget Harvard's systematic anti-Asianism in its admissions policy, first exposed years ago now by Ron Unz, and culminating in the 2023 Students for Fair Administration's case, which led the Supreme Court ultimately to rule that college affirmative action programs were unconstitutional. Has that led to reform? Well, don't ask me. Ask liberal commentator Matthew Iglesias. Quote, "It is, of course, difficult to know exactly what happens in the black box of college admissions," he wrote recently, "but Harvard and most other elite schools do not appear in practice to have dramatically altered their admissions practices." And that shouldn't surprise us when, according to the Harvard Crimson, 86% nearly of the class of 2027 agree that, quote, "Harvard should strive to create a diverse student body," and 2/3 exactly support affirmative action. Harvard has a free speech problem too. Here's the Harvard Crimson from February of this year. Only 1/3 of Harvard's last graduating class felt comfortable expressing their opinions about controversial topics during their time at the college. A 13% decrease from the class of 2023. More than 1/4 of the class of 2024 respondents said they only like to engage socially with people who share their political beliefs. Only 29% disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. 1/3 of students are unconcerned about free speech as an issue on the campus, and about the same proportion, neither concerned nor unconcerned. It's less than 1/5 who think there's a problem. So Harvard students are pretty woke, clearly. But they're not complete outliers. On the contrary, as surveys by Heterodox Academy and FIRE show, they're pretty representative. I drilled down into this, for example, to see if Chicago students had radically different ideas or views on these issues. They don't. There's very little difference in practice on these campuses. Let's just take the issue of Israel and the Palestinians and look at the national data. So according to Pew, 1/3 of Americans under 30 say their sympathies lie either entirely or mostly with the Palestinian people, while just 14% say their sympathies lie entirely or mostly with the Israeli people. For adults as a whole, the shares are 16% pro-Palestinian, 31% pro-Israel. For over 64s, it's 9% and 47% respectively. Americans aged 18 to 29 have the lowest approval of Trump of any generation, 34% approval versus 66% disapproval, compared to 47-55% for all ages. Young Americans are also the least proud to be American, 46% versus 62% for all ages. And they're the most opposed to Trump's handling of DEI. 2/3 of the under 30s disapprove of it, compared with just over half of all ages. And these are findings from a new poll that just came out from NBC on April 27th. Now, as has long been obvious, there's a fairly seamless continuum that leads from illiberalism to outright authoritarianism. So we should not be surprised that Generation Z is also turning away from democracy. There's a new More in Common survey which shows reassuringly that 3/4 of Americans, 80% are Democrats, 85% are Republicans, say the Constitution should be, quote, widely respected because it has provided stability. 63% of Americans say democracy is, quote, definitely the best form of government for America. But nearly half of Gen Z Americans agree that, quote, sometimes it's okay for leaders to set aside democratic principles, e.g. constitutional checks and balances, to fix the economy, compared with 29% of all Americans. A quarter of Gen Z, 25%, say they, quote, don't really care about the Constitution. Only 4 in 10, 42%, say democracy is, quote, definitely the best form of government for America. Ladies and gentlemen, all this is what the higher education establishment has wrought. No doubt, with some help, as John Haidt would say if he were here, from social media apps and smartphones. Harvard merely epitomizes the rot that permeates the entire system. Now, in a recent interview, Mark Andreessen described, quote, the government-supported and funded cartel that doesn't allow new entrants to get access to federal money, and said, quote, they must be allowed to fail. And he talked about the way the system works: federal student loan program, federal research funding, tax exemption for endowments. Here's what he went on to say. The folks at University of Austin are mounting a very valiant effort, and I hope that they succeed, and I'm sure I'm cheering for them. If you could be paying for them too, Mark, that would be great. I mean, cheering is good. Checks, better. But the problem is, he said, suppose you and I want to start a new university. Just suppose. Suppose we were so crazy. And we want to hire all the free-thinking professors. Imagine somebody would do something so crazy. And we want to have the place that fixes all this. Practically speaking, we can't do it because we can't get access to that money. The most direct reason we can't get access to that money, we can't get access to federal student funding because of accreditation, which is, of course, an aspect of the system that the Trump administration also has, rightly, in its sights. I'm nearly done. But here's the kicker. One way to think about the University of Austin is just very simple. We are the anti-Harvard. Whenever I'm trying to solve a problem here, which is often, I ask myself a really simple question. Does Harvard do this? And if the answer is yes, then we should, just as a rule of thumb, do the exact opposite. Does Harvard admissions look like a black box? Then ours should be completely transparent, as it now is, since we introduced our merit-based system whereby candidates with strong SATs, strong test scores, are highly likely to be admitted. Does Harvard assess students in opaque ways that lead to plagiarism and grade inflation? Then we should insist on assessment under strict exam conditions and, as far as possible, a separation of instruction from assessment. Does Harvard discriminate in favor of certain racial or other groups and against others? Then we should, as far as we do under our Constitution, prohibit ourselves from doing that? Is there a culture of fear and self-censorship in Harvard classrooms? Then we should have an atmosphere of freedom and indeed daring in our classrooms. And I can assure you, that is what we have. I know that because I have been teaching classes in this room. And the atmosphere in our classrooms is the difference between day and night as compared with the atmosphere in classrooms at Harvard and indeed at Stanford. I did something just a few weeks ago I would never have dared to do at Stanford. I taught a short class on Billy Connolly, the Glasgow comedian's extraordinary monologue on the crucifixion from 1972, a highly blasphemous account of the Passion, which is at the same time profoundly moving and insightful as well as extremely funny if you can understand the Glaswegian dialect. Can you imagine the trigger warnings that would have been required if I'd proposed to do that with all the blaspheming and foul language and crude humor? If I'd done that at any established university, it would have been a fast track to cancellation. The irony of the story I'm telling you is that Harvard, once upon a time, was the anti-Oxford. Oxford in the late 17th century was anything but a stronghold of intellectual adventure. On the contrary, as Salter and Lobel tell us in their 1954 history of the university, quote, when the king had begun to realize the effects of his folly, he allowed the visitor to restore Ho and the fellows. This restoration took place on October the 25th, 1688. The names of the intruders were struck out of the books. I showed you that. The false fellows expelled. Quote, the golden election of demise in 1689 under the victorious Ho augured well for the intellectual harvest of the coming century, which, however, even in its better years, bore sadly little fruit. Ho lived to the ripe old age of 90 and went on to hold not one, not two, but 3 bishoprics. But I doubt many people regularly read the 30 published sermons of his that you can find in the Bodleian Library. Magdalen, after all the excitements, the expulsions and the restoration, remained a grand but stagnant institution. The same one where, in 1752 to 53, the great historian Edward Gibbon spent 14 months. They proved, he wrote in his memoirs, the most idle and unprofitable of my whole life. Let me quote Gibbon here, because it's relevant to what we are trying to do. In my 16th year, he said, I was not devoid of capacity or application. If that's Edward Gibbon, tell him we're busy. Even my childish reading had displayed an early, though blind, propensity for books, and the shallow flood might have been taught to flow in a deep channel and a clear stream. In the discipline of a well-constituted academy, under the guidance of skillful and vigilant professors, I should gradually have risen from translations to originals, from the Latin to the Greek classics, from dead languages to living science. My hours would have been occupied by useful and agreeable studies. The wanderings of fancy would have been restrained, and I should have escaped the temptations of idleness which finally precipitated my departure from Oxford. I wonder, ladies and gentlemen, how many of today's most gifted Harvard students feel the same way as Gibbon? I think I detect already the beginning of a flow of talent out of the Ivy League, out of the established institutions, and I believe that some of it, very soon, much of it, will be heading our way, because we are the institution that Gibbon describes there. Exactly the ideal institution that he could not have. We are that institution. In fact, Jake, it's almost the definition, that quotation, of what you have built with intellectual foundations. I read it and I thought, that's us, that's it, that's what we're doing. And yet, in the days of James II and John Hoe, Harvard was still a relatively young institution. It had just been founded 1636 to cater to the needs of 10,000 or so Puritans who'd migrated to New England in search of religious freedom. Like UATX, Harvard sprang from a rebellion against a suffocating orthodoxy, though unlike us, it very swiftly embraced, to the extent of witch hunting, an even more rigid orthodoxy. The original motto, you know, was Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae. Harvard started small. People sometimes laugh at the size of our library. Harvard's at first had 400 books. Harvard today is a vast and bloated, a corrupt institution, the culture of which makes a mockery of its truncated motto, Veritas. With all due respect to my friends and former colleagues there, including those like Larry Summers who have been faithful advisors to us, I would not be standing here if I believed Harvard was capable of reforming itself. But my great fear is that, as happened in the case of James II and the Fellows of Magdalen, too forceful an external challenge to Harvard's vices will have the unintended consequences of entrenching them. One may think here of Harvard as being a little like Canada, a country whose chronically woke Liberal Party has just been saved from political oblivion by none other than Donald Trump. And we've just seen the same thing happen in Australia. My nightmare is that the worst culprits in the downfall of Harvard will now re-emerge from their conspicuous silence to pose alongside Alan Garber as the last heroic upholders of academic freedom and integrity. And I bet Carol Hoven last night that within 2 weeks, Claudine Gay will publish an op-ed striking precisely this pose, despite having been the worst president in Harvard's history and an avowed enemy of academic freedom and a debaser of academic standards. The conclusion I draw for our own institution is that we must always eschew the temptations of government money, alluring though it may be to take the taxpayers' dollars. And we must also remain strictly aloof from partisan politics. For there seems no other way to uphold academic freedom and standards than through an absolute independence. The Fellows of Magdalen didn't have it, nor do the professors of Harvard. So I trust then that Carlos as president, Pano as chancellor, will safeguard our independence. I would rather, in the end, remain smaller and independent than larger and subservient to the vagaries of politics. I look forward to a time when our most successful graduates, the Navy SEALs of the mind, as I like to envision them, are able to repay us for our intellectual rigor with the kind of generous philanthropic support that their successes, equipped with that rigor, will enable them to afford. Thank you very much.